It wasn't always the ADHD medication that we know it as today. In fact, it started as a weight loss treatment and a way to help keep soldiers awake during combat. And that past history contributes to its stigma today. So, what are the myths and truths about Addie? Addie is one of kind of the OG ADHD medications along with Ritalin, but it has a long and sordid history before that. So for a while, we were just basically giving amphetamines to everybody. So Addie is a version of two different types of amphetamines. So it's mixed amphetamine salt. So Addie is like one of these types of amphetamines of which there's like a huge variety. So they're all kind of similar to one another in terms of the effects that they produce, but they're also somewhat different in terms of their chemical structure. So basically all of the amphetamines increase dopamine somehow. So in the case of Addie, what it's actually doing is it's increasing dopamine by both increasing the release of dopamine, but also preventing it from being recycled back into the system. So you have more dopamine in your system, more dopamine to produce an effect. The main reason we started using it for ADHD is because we kind of accidentally saw that it helped children who had these kind of behavioral problems before the term ADHD was actually out there. We found that stimulants seemed to help these kids. And so we saw that it helped with those behavioral problems. And then later on, we kind of figured out, hey, this is increasing dopamine in some of the areas that you typically see a decrease of dopamine in patients with ADHD. So you see like too little dopamine in areas like the striatum and the prefrontal cortex. And what we see is that things like Addie are actually increasing dopamine in that area. So kind of counteracting those deficits that people might have. And it does work well for things like attention and impulse control. In fact, and compared to other medication, Addie seems to be in some cases more effective than things like methylphenidate and more effective than things like atomoxetine, so the non-stimulants. The amphetamines work well. Amphetamines really do help people stay awake. For example, Addie is used as a treatment for narcolepsy. And back in the day, we did use it in like World War II to make sure that our troops stayed awake. And then afterwards, we had way too much of it. And so there was this like surplus, and then people just kind of started abusing it. And then it started coming out that amphetamines, yeah, they might keep you awake, but they also may be addictive too. And in fact, that is the kind of main stigma against things like Addie, is that it can be addictive. Yeah, it increases dopamine, and an increase in dopamine is linked to things like drugs of abuse. And yeah, people are for sure misusing these drugs. So we had like a little corner of our high school where people sold Addie and Rit. In fact, out of all of the ADHD medications, it seems like Addie, specifically IR Addie, might be the one that more people are interested in doing things like selling and buying. Well, this is because of how it works and just how available it is. So what you see is that people are more likely to misuse things if they're more available. So if we have a lot of prescriptions for Addie, which we do, they're going to be more likely to divert those prescriptions. And then you also see that people are more likely to use something if it produces a very fast onset. And so you have that immediate release Addie, the stuff that like produces an effect very quickly in comparison to the extended release, that is more likely to be misused. Now, if somebody does not have ADHD and they kind of misuse Addie, that produces different effects than if they do have ADHD. So what we see is that typically people who already have somewhat normal cognitive functioning, so they don't have any sort of impairment, if they take something like Addie, it actually worsens their performance. It makes them worse at tasks. So instead of taking it as sort of like cognitive enhancer, like, oh, I'm just going to buy this so I can perform well in my test, in fact, it's probably doing the exact opposite if you don't have ADHD. It might actually lead to things like long-term memory impairment in people who are misusing it and don't have the disorder. And Addie is less likely to cause addiction in people who have ADHD, which leads to this problem of like, what if you're misdiagnosed? What if you're diagnosed with ADHD, are put on stimulants, but you don't actually have it? Will ADHD treatment actually work differently for you? So like, would it impair your memory long-term? We don't really know right now. And there's another huge problem with Addie, and that is that it causes some terrible side effects. So you have things like nausea, you have things like appetite suppression, which some people like and some people don't like. This can lead to things like problems with growth in children. Insomnia is a huge problem with Addie. And then you see some of the kind of illegal stimulant side effects too. So you get things like psychosis and maybe things like meth mites, where there's like this infestation of bugs underneath your skin that's not actually real. And you have things like Raynaud's, which is linked to ADHD medication too. So you can have like your fingers and your toes, they basically are constantly cold. They don't have as much circulation. And then AI in its infinite wisdom also says that it causes things to taste weird. Now, some people do report this, but we don't have good science on this. In fact, we have like a study in the 70s where they looked at this in rats. And what they found is that it basically just created a taste aversion. So people would take Addie and then it would make them not want to eat because that's just one of the side effects of Addie. And so then they would not want to eat and then things wouldn't taste as good. There's also this idea of like Addy rage, that you get more irritable or aggressive when you take Addy. And they've done some studies on this, but like that's been in rats. So they basically introduced this intruder rat to either rats that were given Addy or rats that were given blow. And what they found was that like blow made them more likely to fight with the intruder rat, but the Addy didn't really do much of anything. Now, there was one study that said that people who abused amphetamines were more likely to commit violent crimes and to be aggressive, and they said it was because of the amphetamines that they were on, definitely not just due to their own human flaws that make them more likely to commit crimes. But that is obviously a flawed study. And then they did more research where they had people like pressing buttons, and one of the buttons was like an aggressive button. So if you press that button, you were going to cause punishment for somebody supposedly on the other side. And if you press a different button, it didn't do that punishment. And what they found is that they just like pressed both buttons more. So they basically were like, haha, I'm more hyperactive, let's just press both. So yes, it does have some problematic side effects, but not actually as many side effects as we might think, but we just for sure need more science on this. Now, there is one more major difference with things like Addy, and that is that there's an XR, so an extended release, and an IR version. So the immediate release produces more immediate effects, so we're talking like 4 to 6 hours, and the extended release has these beads that take longer to break down. So therefore, it should be like 1 dose that you need per day instead of a couple of doses. And IR was the first one, so the immediate release was the first one, and that's what's used for narcolepsy, and the XR is kind of like the second newer version. People like the XR because supposedly has a lower addictive potential. You actually see that it has better adherence because people typically only have to take it once per day. But some people say that they do better on the IR versus the XR. Problem is, we don't have the good studies on this either. So I was looking at like metabolism differences, and there's like basically nothing out there comparing IR to XR in terms of like which one is better for which type of people. Like, it works. And yes, there are side effects, but it is really effective. And there is a major problem in not treating ADHD. That has problematic outcomes too. But also, now we don't make enough of it. We might have generic version issues. And there's a huge stigma against using it because people think that everyone just misuses it. So yes, there are some real pros and there are some real cons, which is true of every drug out there. I'm not really sure why Addy gets the brunt of the hatred.